Fundamentalism and religious terrorism are concepts that have shaped the 21st century, especially following the events of 9/11 and other violent terrorist attacks committed by fundamentalist groups. Previously, following the Second World War, the threat of nationalistic uprisings were the main cause of concern for global governments. Now, this has been replaced by religious fundamentalist groups as the main threat to homeland security. In this short film, I will cover what fundamentalism actually is, where its origins lie, how this can be taken extremely and develop into religious terrorism, and how that has affected the society that we live in today. To begin to understand fundamentalism and how it develops into religious terrorism, we must first understand religion and its change in society as we've developed into modernity. According to Durkheim, religion provides people with a sense of solidarity. As well as this, religion gave people the answers to the world they live in and provides a guideline as to how to live your life. In pre-modernity, religion dominated how a country was ruled, their laws, and people's ways of living and thinking. However, as we had developed into modernity through the Enlightenment, and with it bringing about concepts such as scientific reasoning, new governments, rational-based thinking, and globalization, we have begun to develop towards a secularized society, which can be defined as a transformation from close identification with religious values and institutions towards non-religious values and institutions. So how does fundamentalism come out of this? With all of these rapid changes to a new way of life in a relatively small period of time, for many people this has caused uncertainty and different reactions to these changes. Castells has argued that there are two reactions to the shift into modernity. Project identities, where people accept the new trends brought about by modernity, and also resistant identities, those that wish to revert to traditional or more fundamental ways of living, many of which are found in religion. So what exactly are fundamentalists? Gideon stated that fundamentalists are traditionalists who seek to return to the basics or fundamentals of their faith. Born out of modernity and globalization, fundamentalists turn to this way of believing due to the modern world not giving them the answers or meanings they seek. He describes 5 main features or characteristics of fundamentalist belief. Firstly, they seek to return to traditional basics. They believe their view is the only true view of the world. They justify their views by reference to sacred texts and dogma. They avoid contact with other people who hold other views, and they rely on the guardians of religion to interpret sacred texts and lay down the rules which determine their lifestyle. Therefore, we can see that due to rapid changes and uncertainty that is presented to us by the modern world, groups of people have sought meaning in the strict cooperation or interpretation of traditional religious script, the fundamentals of their religion or belief, and they are known as fundamentalists. The term fundamentalist was originally popularized by Baptist Curtis Lee Laws in 1920 to describe Christians who were ready to battle for the fundamentals as outlined in the Bible. Whilst this was popularized in 1920, Laws was inspired by a movement that began in the late 19th century following the Civil War in America. This traditional movement, which originally began as evangelicals, essentially struggled to adapt to the new modernist ways of thinking that were appearing across the globe. This led to a split in beliefs among society, which Marsden argued developed into a fundamentalist versus modernist thinking split in North America, leading to attacks on what was prescribed in the Bible, such as the virgin birth of Jesus and the theory of creation. As this movement of evangelicals, or fundamentalists, grew in spite of these drastic changes to society, religious leaders across the US came together, eventually leading to a 12-volume set of books entitled The Fundamentals, A Testimony to the Truth. This 12-volume series, published between 1910 and 1915, comprised of over 90 essays developed by over 64 Christian writers that were known to represent major Christian denominations across America, and it was mainly edited by Reuben A. Torrey, a prolific Christian writer, evangelist, and pastor. The essays, and books in general, can be seen as reactionary to the time they were written. As modern thought began to dominate and religious belief began to decline, the series can be seen as an attempt to re-establish the doctrine of the Bible, as the books mainly defended orthodox Christian views. This can be seen with examples of chapters such as The Virgin Birth of Christ, written by James Orr, and The Proof of Living God, by Arthur T. Pearson. In addition to this, the fundamentals attacked modern theology, such as socialism, Darwinism, modern Christian Science, the rise of atheism, and even Catholicism, as being impure and against God's will. Whilst 3 million copies were sent out to Christian figures, leaders, and schools across the English-speaking countries, this did very little to stop the rising secularization of our developing modern society. The term fundamentalist, or fundamentalism, whilst Christian in origin, has become much more prominent with various religions throughout the 20th and 21st century, due to the rising use of religious fundamentalist groups using terrorism to spread their views, or attack those who oppose them. Religious terrorism itself is often hard to define, as the acts committed, targets, aims, and groups involved differ over time and place. One definition by Heather Gregg defines religious terrorism as the threat or use of force with the purpose of influencing or coercing governments and or populations towards saliently religious goals. Whereas Mython and Warkate define terrorism as being generally understood to be the use of violence and intimidation to disrupt or coerce a government and or identifiable community. Driven by religious motivation, terrorist acts are commonly directed against civilian targets and populations, with the intention of creating insecurity and injury. Whilst there are differences across varying definitions, similar elements begin to appear, such as the use of extreme violence on civilian targets. It has the goal of spreading an agenda of religious fundamentalist belief, or attack those that oppose it, and it has political motivations. Over the last few decades, and with a rampant increase over the 21st century, much of homeland security, legislation, and media attention has been directed towards Islamic fundamentalist groups, also known as Islamists or jihadists, and the terror they have induced across the globe. As J.S. Nielsen writes in 1994, terrorism and other forms of violence committed in the name of religion seem to have become regular headline material. Fundamentalist violence has, over the last decade and a half, come to be associated in the Western mind, especially with Islam. More recently, we have experienced events inside our own borders in Europe and the US which appear to confirm the phenomenon. Islamist terror organisations have become prominent due to their ability to operate over vast areas of the globe, and their willingness to carry out extremely violent, often suicidal acts, notably 9/11, which took the lives of over 2,000 people. They have also created mass anxiety across the Western world by, according to Garland, disrobing the myth that the state is capable of providing order and control over its territory. And one of the most well-known Islamist groups that has risen to prominence across the Middle East and the Western world is, of course, ISIS. ISIS, or more commonly known as Islamic State, is an Islamist terrorist group founded in the Middle East in what is thought to be 2012 or 13 as a splinter group from another well-known Islamist organisation, Al-Qaeda. Known for their unpredictable acts of suicidal violence, public executions and crucifixions, ISIS's aims are to establish an Islamic caliphate, which is an Islamic state ruled by a single leader considered to be the successor to the Prophet Muhammad, across Iraq, Syria, and eventually the world. And according to CNN, at one point in 2014, 34,000 square miles in Iraq and Syria were under the control and jurisdiction of Islamic State. In those areas controlled, Islamic State implemented Sharia law, which is a set of guidelines in the Quran that has connotations on the family, women, sexuality, politics, and other areas of life, most of which are not implemented at all within the liberal freedoms we have as a society in the West. However, according to the Islamic Networks group, they will often quote cherry-picked and misinterpreted versions of Sharia law and Quranic verses to justify their actions, and as an attempt to recruit others across the globe in the name of Islam. Whilst ISIS and similar groups argue they are carrying out the will of the Quran, it is quite obvious they use the Quran as an excuse to carry out extreme violence as a means for political ends, and the global Muslim community has frequently denounced their interpretation of Islam. ISIS's strong and fast uprising, ability to justify their actions to their audience, and willingness to die for their extreme interpretation of Islam to be spread, has caused widespread anxiety across many nations, leading many others to carry out further military action in the Middle East, which in turn has further, in the eyes of ISIS themselves, justified their own actions. The threat of global terrorist attacks carried out by coordinated religious fundamentalist groups, such as ISIS, has caused mass anxiety and reaction from a governmental level. In the UK, according to the website UK Public Spending, levels of Homeland Defence spending previously to 9/11 was £28 billion. However, it has increased every year since, with it now nearing double what it was 17 years ago, around £48 billion per annum. This money has been spent on numerous sources, such as intelligence in regards to MI5 or 6 to monitor communications of fundamentalist groups, and also increased firearms officers, such as those found at big events and those that are set up in big city areas in anticipation of terrorist attacks happening, including over 600 armed officers found on London's streets and based in hotspots where attacks are likely to happen. On a legislative level, we have seen many changes following the 9/11 attacks, many of which cross borders between privacy and public safety. For example, the Snoopers Charter, which according to a government white paper, allows for the recording of telecommunications and demands greater cooperation from broadband providers and social media outlets in monitoring and revealing information communicated on their services. Anxiety across a societal level has also increased, leading to rises in hate and fear, especially in relation to big cities. One of these examples is the Italian football bomb scare, where 1,500 people were injured in a stampede at the sound of a firework going off near a Juventus game. This, and a number of other incidents across the West, display how bad our anxiety towards attacks from these groups are, and the media are quick to label anything out of the ordinary as a terrorist attack, especially if the perpetrator is of a foreign ethnic origin. We've also seen a rise in Islamophobia in recent years, in conjunction with a rise in Islamist fundamentalist groups and their attacks. This can be attributed not just to the widespread anxiety felt around these groups, but also the media's rampant and often unhelpful reporting of incidents around the globe. Whilst the Muslim community across the West has numerously denounced ISIS and similar groups as being a completely false representation of Islam, we have seen a rise in revenge attacks on Muslims. The Finsbury Park attack, where a white male purposefully drove his car into a group of Muslims leaving Ramadan prayer service, is a prime example of this. Injuring 9 people and fatally hitting 1, Darren Osborne, the man who carried out the attack, was recorded stating in a pub, "I'm going to kill all the Muslims. Muslims are all terrorists. Your families are all going to be Muslim. I'm going to take it into my own hands."